support. So you remember before I mentioned that a lot of governments are viewing the pandemic as kind of an opportunity to show their effectiveness. Non-state actors view that as well, and a lot of them are trying to bolster their own popular support in the light of the pandemic. So one example of this is in Afghanistan. The Taliban has launched its own public awareness campaign on sanitation. It's had its own very public sort of PR campaign showing Taliban members managing the crisis, going door to door with temperature checks and distributing hand sanitizer. There's real questions how genuine an effort this is and how much is just window dressing, but nonetheless, they're really trying to use this opportunity to make the point that the Afghan government isn't effective at governing, and they, the Taliban, are. Sort of parallel efforts in the Western Hemisphere. In Brazil, there have been reports of drug trafficking gangs in Rio imposing a curfew to contain the virus. There's reports that in Mexico, many gangs, including the Sinaloa cartel, which is a major cartel, are handing out food and toilet paper packages to poor residents, and they're calling these packages Chapo packages. So in all these cases, it's, this is sort of a double-edged sword, because obviously response and assistance is badly needed. Imposing social distancing is often an appropriate response, but these groups are obviously not totally or exclusively altruistic as well. They're really trying to demonstrate their own effectiveness, build support, especially in places where the state authorities may not have the most effective or capable response.
And that's Chapo packages like Chapo Guzman, the Sinaloa leader.
Precisely, yeah. Yes.
So non-state actors, but also state actors, are trying to demonstrate their effectiveness. And one thing in your report that I thought was interesting is they're not only trying to demonstrate it to their own constituents, their own people, but on the global stage in multilateral settings, et cetera. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the US strategy and goals and the instrumentalization of the coronavirus. For example, China has been touting their efforts and how they were able to control the virus and the outbreak at home, and then sort of setting themselves up as this example of how to respond internationally. And I think that's really interesting as far as a model to follow.
So you're right. Many nation states are instrumentalizing either the pandemic or the response to the pandemic to assert their own objectives. So China and the United States have obviously been locked in a war of words and a sort of a war of narratives over first who's responsible for the virus and then who's helpful in dealing with it. China has had some particularly high-level coverage, assistance outreach to many African nations, bringing in assistance to those countries and elsewhere, trying to make the point that they're helping on a global scale. The United States, for its part, has insisted that the virus be called the Wuhan virus, sort of trying to ascribe blame. I think the bottom line from my perspective is that, unfortunately, framing this as a competition between the United States and China sort of misses the point entirely. The virus presents a competition on a global scale, but the competition is between the virus on one hand and humankind on the other. So every moment and every policy decision that's spent trying to win this war of images is a moment that's spent not trying to deal with the virus. We've obviously learned over the past few months that the virus doesn't respect borders, it doesn't respect immigration restrictions, it doesn't respect trade restrictions. So really the only effective response has to be a global and multilateral one. But unfortunately, we're seeing trends really in the opposite direction, especially from those two major players. But we're seeing a lot of hunkering down in general as sort of looking inward, and even among other countries as well, as they try to deal with the pandemic at home. So I think this is a trend that we will continue to see many countries sort of jockeying either to provide assistance and win prestige as a result, or to get other policy breakthroughs because of the way that the pandemic has really shuffled the deck on the global stage.
And do you think that there should be policy changes as a result of the pandemic as far as U.S. foreign policy? So you mentioned sanctions against places like Iran and Venezuela. Obviously, there are governments, as you said, who are looking at this as an opportunity rather than purely in the interests of their own populaces. But are some changes maybe merited?
Yeah, I think on a case-to-case basis, that's entirely possible. I think, the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis that the pandemic is bringing up, combined with the fact that, again, its ramifications are global, so they can't really be contained. I think it's worth rethinking, again, on a case-by-case basis. And so I don't want to prescribe for any sort of blanket policy on should the United States rethink particular sanctions regimes, because I think there's a lot of considerations on them. And I think sometimes humanitarian exceptions are totally appropriate, because oftentimes sanctions are meant to be punishing leadership or political decision makers. If it turns out that they're actually causing suffering among the population, I think that's worth a serious rethink. So that's my general feeling. Overall, I think that, the biggest sort of policy rethink that I would like to see the United States make is a sort of a move towards a more global, multilateral, cooperative response in many domains. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that in the pandemic. I think, again, the framing of competition and great power competition is having really tangible detrimental effects to our own U.S. interests in dealing with this pandemic, as well as the rest of humankind.
We'll be right back.
Hey, thanks for listening to UC3P, the main page. We know you're enjoying this episode, and we really want to get you back to it as soon as possible. The problem is, if you're listening to this, there's a really good chance you haven't subscribed to the show yet. Don't worry, that's super easy to fix. Just go on your phone, pick your favorite podcast app, and type in UC3P or the main page. It's easy to subscribe, and we know you don't want to miss any more episodes. Again, type in UC3P or the main page and subscribe. Now go tell a friend.
Beyond great power competition and all of these issues, there are real people and real lives behind all of these issues, as you've mentioned. And humanitarian workers are not able to get access to a lot of the places where they worked before. I think we'd be really interested to hear, you have been a practitioner, work a lot with practitioners on the ground. What are you seeing during this pandemic for the people who are actually on site?
Yeah, it's such an important point. Sort of, we can get in these lofty conversations about the big trends, but the harsh reality is that people on the ground are being affected in really concrete ways. And unfortunately, the international community's efforts to provide humanitarian assistance, resolve conflicts on the ground is being undermined in really concrete ways as well. So a couple examples of this, as you may know, Afghanistan was sort of on the brink of a dialogue among many parts of the Afghan polity on sort of what's the future for Afghanistan. There was a preliminary US-Taliban deal, but then the next step really had to be a broader Afghan dialogue, intra-Afghan dialogue. Unfortunately, now with the pandemic, it stalled those talks. It's really hard to build trust remotely. It's really hard to conduct peace talks remotely. And the upshot of that is that the incredible level of violence in Afghanistan, the incredible level of civilian casualties just continues on. So without peace talks, this horrible violent stalemate continues. Other examples of this kind of thing, of this impact on the people on the ground, we can look at Somalia. So Somalia was sort of on the brink of its own dialogue process between the federal government and regional states. It needed, I think, that it's a very fragile government there, and it needed a lot of in-person international support to these efforts. And now the international community had to downsize in a really dramatic way, so there's just going to be much less in-person support as a result. We're also seeing this kind of consequence in peacekeeping efforts particularly across Africa. So in a lot of African Union countries, there's lockdowns and distancing measures. So it's made it a lot harder for new peacekeeping staffers to be deployed. It obviously undermines peace building work as well. And then the final huge way that this is affecting people on the ground, assistance on the ground, is just the modalities of aid distribution. The sort of gone are the days where you can put 5 people in a Jeep and go somewhere. It's really undermined the mechanics of aid distribution. We're also seeing a really troubling trend in some places about perceptions of the inequities in distribution of aid and how this might incite more violence. So as the coronavirus is bringing its own sort of new tranche of aid in some ways, a lot of citizens, and we're seeing this in Afghanistan in particular, citizens feeling like it's not being distributed in a fair or equal manner, and that's led to more violence. So you sort of see this compounding series of challenges as the virus takes hold that unfortunately are making international assistance efforts, which were already really hard. And then the final point to make on this is, obviously a lot of these challenges in terms of doing the international community's work are pretty parallel to what we in the United States are facing in our own jobs. We've moved to remote work, etc. But the problem is, in a lot of these countries, you can do some aid delivery remotely from the air, but not much. And you can't do a lot of remote technology in a lot of these areas that have, much lesser communications technology capability. So it's really hard to sort of think about how some of these realms could be shifted online or to a remote setting.
So kind of looking forward, I know you mentioned that a lot of the report is still preliminary. What are the recommendations that we can take away?
I think as we've covered, unfortunately, it paints a pretty bleak picture. I think I and my co-editor Jarrett really agreed that in most ways, the coronavirus is making a bad situation worse in many conflict areas. But we also wanted to stress that that doesn't need to be the full picture. And going forward, we hope it's not the full picture. So we do know historically that natural disasters, when they occur, can potentially provide a window of opportunity or some positive disruption. It can shuffle the decks in ways that might be positive. So one example we hear about a lot is the 2004 tsunami that helped a pathway emerge towards peace in Aceh. That's one example. Unfortunately, the same 2004 tsunami did not lead to peace in Sri Lanka, which was also affected by it. So you can sort of see these things can go either way. But the point being, there are ways in which positive disruption could emerge from this. And what I'm going to be looking at going forward in my own research, and many other colleagues are as well, is what might be some of those positive ways and how can we mobilize around them. At this early stage, and from the sort of 30,000 feet view that I've discussed with you both today, it's really hard to predict what those opportunities might be and sort of what chances might emerge in specific conflicts or specific fragile states. They will likely be very localized and specific to that area. You may have seen that the UN Secretary General issued a call for a global ceasefire a few weeks ago. Subsequent to that, we did see a number of armed groups or armed actors proclaim that they were temporarily stopping fighting to facilitate humanitarian response. So we saw this in places ranging from Cameroon to Central African Republic, to Colombia, to Libya, to Myanmar, to the Philippines, to South Sudan, to Ukraine, to Yemen. Many of these declarations of ceasefire have since been overturned or did not stick. So this isn't to actually say that this is a rosy picture, but it just gives you an opportunity, a sense that there may be opportunities. So what I would like to see going forward, and what I'm going to be looking at, is how can we in the international community be prepared to respond to these positive opportunities when they do come? How can we be ready to capitalize on them? Or at least how can we be ready to stave off the worst outcomes that can occur in these conflict areas? Do we need to think of a different way to monitor developments on the ground, especially as many of us have gone more remote in our own presence on the ground in these areas, especially as many journalists in conflict-affected places are either under siege still more or have to be reporting remotely? So how do we even get our information? A related question is, do we need to change our assistance modalities somehow to respond to this new universe? Do we need more expeditionary negotiation support? Are there other ways we can look at technology to help address these these challenges. So these are all the questions that I'm going to be looking at in the coming months as in my own research, trying to pivot from laying out